The funeral had already been delayed twice before anyone realized the gorilla was the reason. More than 200 people stood silently beneath the gray morning sky at Pine Grove Memorial Cemetery outside Portland, Oregon, staring at the black hearse parked beside the burial site, while cold wind moved through the rows of white chairs. Some whispered that it was disrespectful to keep the ceremony waiting. Others blamed the heavy traffic outside the sanctuary. But none of them knew that nearly 15 miles away, inside a reinforced steel enclosure at the Cascade Wildlife Refuge, a 700-pound silverback named Koba had been sitting completely still in front of a locked service gate for almost 3 straight hours, refusing to move, refusing to eat, and refusing to let anyone enter the building. "This isn't normal," veterinarian Emily Carter whispered as she slowly lowered the untouched tray of fruit near the enclosure fence. Koba didn't even look at it. The massive gorilla simply stared at the old brown jacket folded on the concrete floor beside him, the same jacket belonging to Daniel Brooks, the wildlife rescuer who had raised Koba since infancy after poachers killed his troop nearly 20 years earlier. Daniel had died 4 days ago in what authorities called a tragic highway accident during a late-night storm, and ever since then, something about Koba's behavior had changed in ways nobody at the refuge could explain. The gorilla had stopped sleeping through the night. Security cameras captured him pacing in circles until sunrise, occasionally pressing one giant hand against the walls as if listening for something beneath the concrete. Twice, staff members heard him making low rumbling sounds that almost resembled human crying. But the strangest moment happened the previous evening when Emily entered the enclosure carrying one of Daniel's old flannel shirts. The second Koba saw it, he froze completely, slowly reached toward the fabric, and then backed away into the darkest corner of the habitat like he was afraid of something no one else could see. "He understands Daniel is gone," one ranger quietly said that morning while preparing for the funeral. "Animals grieve too." But Emily wasn't fully convinced. Grief didn't explain why Koba kept staring toward the sanctuary's east access road every few minutes. Grief didn't explain why he reacted violently anytime someone mentioned the cemetery. And grief definitely didn't explain what happened less than 40 minutes before the funeral service began. Because according to the sanctuary's surveillance footage, Koba suddenly stood up, walked directly toward the reinforced maintenance door that had never once failed in 12 years, and began striking the metal with terrifying force. Not roaring, not attacking, just hitting the exact same spot over and over again like he knew precisely where to break it. Staff members panicked. One employee immediately called local authorities while another reached for the emergency tranquilizer kit. But before anyone could stop him, the final steel hinge snapped loose from the frame. Koba pushed the gate open, stepped out into the pouring rain, and disappeared into the surrounding forest without looking back once. By the time police arrived at the sanctuary, the silverback was already gone. And now, standing beside Daniel Brooks' coffin as nervous funeral guests checked their phones and whispered to one another beneath dark umbrellas, Emily suddenly felt her own phone vibrate inside her coat pocket. Her face went pale the second she read the sanctuary alert flashing across the screen. Then somewhere beyond the cemetery gates, tires screeched violently against wet pavement, several people screamed, and a little girl near the front row pointed toward the road with trembling hands as an enormous black figure emerged through the fog and began moving straight toward Daniel's funeral. The moment people saw the giant silverback approaching through the fog, panic spread across the cemetery like a wave. Chairs scraped against the wet ground, umbrellas fell, and several mourners rushed backward toward the parking lot while police officers shouted for everyone to stay calm. But Koba did not charge at anyone. He moved slowly across the soaked grass with heavy, deliberate steps, rain sliding down the dark fur covering his enormous shoulders. His eyes never wandered toward the crowd. They stayed locked on the black coffin beneath the funeral canopy as if nothing else in the world existed. Emily could barely breathe as she stepped forward through the chaos. "Do not shoot," she pleaded toward the officers near the entrance. "Please, just give him a second." One deputy tightened his grip on the tranquilizer rifle anyway. Nobody at Pine Grove Memorial had ever dealt with a 700-pound gorilla walking into a funeral service before. To them, Koba looked terrifying. But Emily knew something the others did not. In the 19 years Daniel Brooks had cared for Koba, The gorilla had never once harmed a human being, not even during surgeries, not even during storms when thunder shook the sanctuary and frightened the other animals into violent panic. Daniel used to say Koba had a strange way of understanding people. He remembered voices. He recognized footsteps. He even reacted differently to people depending on their emotions. Daniel once laughed while telling Emily, "That gorilla knows when somebody is hurting before they say a single word." At first, she thought he was exaggerating. Then she started seeing it herself. 2 winters earlier, a volunteer named Rachel had quietly learned that her father was dying from cancer. She told nobody at the sanctuary. Yet somehow, Koba behaved differently around her the entire week. Instead of staying distant behind the enclosure glass, he would sit near her for hours without moving, gently pressing one hand against the barrier whenever she walked by. Rachel later admitted that those silent moments with Koba were the only times she stopped crying. That was why Daniel loved him so much. He never treated Koba like an attraction or an experiment. To Daniel, the gorilla was family. Every morning before sunrise, Daniel brought him breakfast personally instead of leaving it to the staff. He talked to him constantly while cleaning the habitat, sometimes about football scores, sometimes about weather reports, sometimes about absolutely nothing at all. And every single evening before leaving the sanctuary, Daniel always tapped twice against the enclosure gate and said the same words. "Good night, big guy. I will see you tomorrow." The night before Daniel's accident was the only time that routine changed. Security footage later showed Daniel leaving the refuge after midnight during heavy rain without saying goodbye to Koba. Nobody knew why he left so suddenly. Emily remembered watching the video 3 separate times because something about it felt wrong. Daniel looked nervous, distracted. He kept glancing behind his shoulder like he expected someone to follow him into the parking lot. Less than 2 hours later, Highway Patrol reported his truck overturned near mile marker 83 outside Salem. Since that moment, Koba had become almost unrecognizable. He stopped playing with enrichment toys. He ignored visitors completely. 3 times staff members found him sitting alone beside the east enclosure wall long after midnight, staring into the dark forest beyond the sanctuary fences without blinking. But the strangest part happened every evening at exactly 9:17 p.m. No matter where he was, Koba would suddenly stand up, walk toward the empty service gate near Daniel's old office, and wait there silently for several minutes before slowly returning to his habitat. At first, Emily thought it was grief, until the sanctuary electrician discovered something disturbing hidden beneath Daniel's desk only hours before the funeral began. A second cell phone nobody knew he owned was still plugged into the wall charger, and according to the screen, the last outgoing call had been made at exactly 9:17 p.m. on the night Daniel died. For several long seconds, nobody moved. Rain hammered against the cemetery tents while dozens of terrified eyes stared at the funeral program resting on top of the black duffel bag inside Daniel's Jeep. Koba stood a few feet away from the vehicle, breathing heavily, his massive chest rising and falling as muddy water dripped from his fur. To Emily, the gorilla looked desperate, almost pleading. But to everyone else, he looked unpredictable, dangerous. One of the deputies finally stepped forward and lowered his voice toward the funeral director. "This has gone too far," he said grimly. "That animal already destroyed sanctuary property and frightened half the people here. We need to sedate him now before somebody gets hurt." Emily immediately shook her head. "No, Koba is trying to show us something." But her words barely mattered anymore. Several mourners were already crying in panic. Daniel's older brother Marcus looked furious as he pointed toward the cracked windshield. "That thing should never have been brought near this funeral," he snapped. "My family is grieving, and now this circus is turning Daniel's burial into a nightmare." Emily tried to explain that Koba had escaped on his own, but Marcus was no longer listening. Ever since Daniel devoted his life to the sanctuary, there had always been tension inside the family. Marcus believed his brother cared more about animals than people. And now, watching a giant gorilla interrupt the funeral in front of reporters and guests only deepened his anger. "Daniel treated that animal like a son," Marcus muttered bitterly. "And this is how it repays him." The words hit Emily harder than she expected because deep down, she knew Marcus was wrong. Koba was not acting out of aggression. There was intention behind everything he did. But she could also feel the mood shifting rapidly around them. Fear spreads fast when people do not understand something. especially something powerful. One frightened guest told officers the gorilla had targeted the hearse. Another swore Koba was trying to break into the coffin. A woman near the back claimed the animal was becoming territorial over Daniel's belongings. Within minutes, the story growing among the crowd no longer resembled reality. Koba was turning from grieving companion into unstable threat. And the more frightened people became, the more isolated the gorilla looked standing there alone in the rain. Then another misunderstanding made everything worse. A young boy around 10 years old accidentally slipped near the muddy pathway beside the Jeep, dropping his umbrella. Instantly, Koba rushed toward him. Several people screamed at once. Police officers raised their weapons again, while the child's mother pulled him backward in terror. But Koba never touched the boy. The gorilla simply picked up the fallen umbrella carefully and held it out toward the child for one brief moment before setting it down gently on the grass. The little boy stared at him in confusion, but the crowd only saw the speed of Koba's movement, not the intention behind it. "Enough," one deputy shouted. "Everybody back away now." Emily's stomach tightened as animal control trucks finally rolled through the cemetery gates with flashing lights reflecting across the rain. Two handlers stepped out carrying heavy tranquilizer equipment and reinforced transport restraints designed for large primates. Koba watched them arrive instantly, and for the first time all morning, fear appeared in his eyes. Not anger, not aggression, fear. The silverback slowly backed away from the Jeep and looked directly at Emily like he understood exactly what was about to happen. Emily stepped forward again despite the officers blocking her path. "Please listen to me," she begged. "Daniel trusted this animal more than anyone. Koba is trying to tell us something." But Marcus interrupted coldly before she could continue. "My brother is dead because he spent his life around dangerous animals," he said. "I am not letting this thing ruin his funeral too." Then he turned toward the handlers and gave the order Emily dreaded most. "Take the gorilla back to the sanctuary," Marcus said firmly. "And after today, I want him transferred somewhere far away from here for good." The rain finally began to weaken as the animal control team approached Koba slowly from both sides with tranquilizer rifles raised chest high. Funeral guests continued backing away across the cemetery lawn, while flashing emergency lights reflected off the wet headstones like scattered red stains in the dark. Koba did not resist. That was the part Emily could not stop thinking about. The silverback who had torn through a reinforced sanctuary gate less than an hour earlier now stood perfectly still beside Daniel's Jeep, his eyes moving between the black duffel bag and Emily, as though he was waiting for her to understand something before it was too late. "Easy now," one handler muttered while stepping closer with a sedative dart prepared. Koba lowered his head slightly, but did not move toward anyone. The giant animal looked exhausted, defeated. Emily felt a painful knot forming in her chest as she watched Marcus sign the emergency transfer paperwork under a funeral tent. Once Koba was sedated, animal control planned to move him temporarily to a high-security primate facility outside Seattle until officials determined whether he remained safe around the public. The decision felt horribly wrong to her, but nobody wanted to listen anymore. Fear had already won. Then something small happened that nearly everyone missed. As one of the handlers carefully opened the Jeep door to retrieve the black duffel bag before transport crews secured the vehicle, a folded paper slipped quietly from the side pocket and landed in the mud beneath the tire. Nobody noticed except Emily. She stepped closer while the others remained focused on Koba. At first glance, the paper looked like nothing important, just a rain-soaked receipt partially covered in dirt. But when Emily picked it up, her heartbeat suddenly quickened. It was not a receipt at all. It was a fuel purchase slip from a gas station nearly 70 miles north of the sanctuary, stamped with the date of Daniel's accident. Emily frowned immediately because the location made no sense. Daniel's reported highway crash happened south of Salem. Why would his truck have been refueled north of Portland less than 2 hours earlier? Confused, she turned the damp paper over and noticed something else written across the back in Daniel's handwriting. Just 3 rushed words scribbled in black marker. "If Koba reacts." The rest had been smeared away by rainwater. Emily stared at the message in silence while cold wind moved through the cemetery trees around her. "If Koba reacts." Reacts to what? Her eyes slowly lifted toward the gorilla again. Koba was no longer watching the handlers. He was staring directly at the paper trembling in Emily's hands. The moment their eyes met, the silverback suddenly made that same low clicking sound deep in his throat again, softer this time, almost impatient. Emily's pulse started racing. Then another detail struck her even harder. Daniel almost never used handwritten notes. He recorded everything digitally because his handwriting was notoriously awful. Yet whatever message he started writing here had clearly mattered enough to rush onto paper. Emily carefully unfolded the rest of the damp slip, hoping more words survived, but most of the ink had dissolved into dark streaks. All except one faint line near the bottom. Do not trust. The final word was gone. Miss Carter, one deputy called sharply. We need to move the animal now. Emily quickly slipped the paper into her coat pocket before anyone else could see it. Her mind was spinning. Suddenly, the second cell phone under Daniel's desk, the strange late-night drive, Koba's panic at the funeral, and the black duffel bag no longer felt random. Something connected all of it. Something Daniel had tried to warn somebody about before he died. And somehow, Koba knew it too. The handlers lifted the tranquilizer rifles higher as they prepared the shot, but before they could fire, Emily abruptly stepped in front of them. Wait, she said firmly, unable to take her eyes off the Jeep. Before anybody moves Koba anywhere, I need to see what is inside that bag. The entire cemetery seemed to pause after Emily's words. Rainwater dripped from the funeral tents while animal control officers exchanged uncertain looks beside the raised tranquilizer rifles. Marcus stepped forward immediately, frustration written across his face. Emily, this is not the time, he snapped. Daniel is gone. Whatever is in that bag can wait. But Emily could not shake the feeling growing inside her chest. Koba stood motionless near the Jeep now, no longer making noise, no longer resisting anyone. It was almost as if the gorilla had accomplished the one thing he came there to do. Slowly, Emily walked toward the passenger side door with dozens of nervous eyes fixed on her. The black duffel bag sat exactly where Koba had pointed. Rain dotted the canvas surface while the funeral program remained carefully placed on top, like some strange marker. Emily hesitated only a second before pulling the zipper open. Inside was not clothing, not money, not sanctuary paperwork. It was recording equipment. A compact audio recorder, extra batteries, a flashlight, and beneath them all, a thick manila envelope stamped with the words Private Field Reports. Emily's stomach tightened instantly. Daniel had never mentioned any field reports to the sanctuary staff. Marcus frowned impatiently beside her. What is this supposed to prove? Emily ignored him and opened the envelope with trembling hands. Several photographs slid partially free. At first, they looked ordinary. Sanctuary fences, maintenance sheds, delivery trucks. Then she saw the dates. Every photograph had been taken during the past 3 weeks. And every single image included the same thing hidden somewhere in the background. A dark blue pickup truck with no license plates. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She recognized that truck immediately. It belonged to Victor Hale, the private contractor recently hired to oversee security upgrades around the refuge after reports of attempted break-ins near the animal enclosures. Daniel himself had recommended him. Emily quickly reached deeper into the bag and pulled out the audio recorder. The screen still had battery power. One saved file blinked across the display with a timestamp from the night Daniel died. Play it, Marcus muttered quietly now, his anger fading into unease. Emily pressed the button. Static crackled through the rain for several long seconds before Daniel's voice suddenly filled the cemetery speakers. Tired, breathless, nervous. If anybody finds this, he said, do not trust the new security team. The crowd fell silent instantly. Even the police officers stopped moving. Daniel continued speaking over distant thunder and engine noise in the recording. Somebody inside the refuge has been helping wildlife traffickers move endangered animals through the sanctuary transport system. I did not realize it until Koba started reacting every time Victor's truck entered the property. Emily's eyes widened slowly. Memories slammed into place all at once. Koba refusing to approach the east service gate. The clicking sounds whenever security vehicles arrived. The panic the night someone tried cutting through the perimeter fence. Daniel's voice continued, shakily through the speaker. At first I thought Koba was becoming aggressive, but he was not reacting to people. He was reacting to specific scents, fuel, chemicals, sedatives. He knew something was wrong long before I did. Several funeral guests exchanged stunned looks, while Marcus stared speechless at the recorder in Emily's hands. Then came the final part of the message. Daniel lowered his voice almost to a whisper. "If anything happens to me, check the transport manifests hidden in the secondary phone beneath my desk. Koba knows which vehicles are involved. That is why he kept trying to stop me from leaving tonight." Emily felt tears sting her eyes as she slowly turned toward the gorilla. Suddenly, every terrifying moment from the funeral transformed into something completely different. Koba had not come to destroy the ceremony. He had come because Daniel's Jeep contained the evidence. The gorilla had been trying desperately to stop the wrong people from taking it away before anyone discovered the truth. Koba looked exhausted standing there in the rain, surrounded by frightened humans who had treated him like a dangerous beast when all along he had been protecting the final warning his only family tried to leave behind. And when Marcus finally looked back at the silverback again, his face went completely pale as he realized the horrible truth. The one creature everyone feared at the funeral had been the only one who understood Daniel was in danger before Daniel himself did. For a long moment after Daniel's final recording ended, nobody at the cemetery seemed able to breathe. The rain had softened into a cold mist, but no one reached for their umbrellas anymore. They were all staring at Koba. The same gorilla they had feared. The same gorilla they had nearly sedated. The same grieving animal who had crossed 15 miles through rain and traffic, not to ruin a funeral, but to protect the last truth Daniel Brooks had left behind. Emily slowly lowered the recorder against her chest, and every strange thing Koba had done began replaying in her mind with painful clarity. The way he had refused to leave the service gate at the sanctuary. The way he had placed the funeral program on the duffel bag instead of tearing it apart. The way he had rushed toward the little boy only to return the fallen umbrella. The way he kept making that clicking sound, not as a threat, but as a warning Daniel had learned to understand too late. Emily looked at the handlers still holding the tranquilizer equipment, and shame crossed her face. "Lower those," she said, her voice breaking but firm. Now, one by one, the handlers slowly lowered their rifles. The deputies followed, their expressions changing from fear to discomfort, then something heavier. Guilt. Koba remained where he was beside the Jeep, his huge hands resting in the mud, his head slightly bowed as if the weight of the entire cemetery had settled onto his shoulders. He did not look victorious. He did not look angry. He looked tired in a way that made even strangers feel something twist inside their chests. Marcus, who had been so certain only minutes earlier, took one slow step toward him. His jaw trembled. He looked from Daniel's coffin to the gorilla and back again, as if seeing both of them clearly for the first time. All those years, Marcus had believed Koba had taken Daniel away from the family, that the sanctuary, the animals, and the long nights had mattered more than blood. But now he understood something that broke him quietly. Daniel had not chosen Koba instead of family. Daniel had simply recognized family in a place Marcus never knew how to look. The older man removed his black funeral coat and walked toward the silverback with cautious steps. Emily almost stopped him, but Koba did not move away. Marcus knelt several feet from him in the wet grass, holding the coat in both hands. "He loved you," Marcus whispered, his voice rough and almost unfamiliar. "I was too angry to see that." Koba stared at him silently. Then, with impossible gentleness, the silverback reached out and touched the sleeve of the coat with the back of his fingers, the same way he used to touch Daniel's jacket through the enclosure bars. That small movement did what the recording had not. It broke the entire crowd. Not with loud sobs, not with dramatic apologies, but with the kind of silence that happens when people realize they have judged something pure because they were afraid of it. The little boy whose umbrella Koba had returned stepped out from behind his mother and carefully placed the umbrella near the gorilla's feet. "He was helping," the child said softly. His mother covered her mouth, unable to answer. Emily wiped her face with the back of her hand and turned toward the nearest deputy. "Seal Daniel's Jeep. Secure the bag. Send officers to the sanctuary now and find that second phone before anyone else does." Then she looked at Marcus, then at Koba, and her voice became steady. "And nobody is transferring him. Not today. Not ever without a full review. We owe Daniel the truth, and we owe Koba protection." For the first time since arriving at the cemetery, Koba lifted his head. His eyes moved from Emily to Daniel's coffin, then back to the black duffel bag, as if making sure the humans had finally understood. And in that cold gray cemetery, surrounded by people who had almost taken everything from him, the gorilla who had been treated like a threat became the one everyone was now determined to save. The funeral never resumed the way anyone expected. Instead of rushing Kobo away in restraints, the cemetery slowly transformed into something quieter and strangely human. Deputies lowered the yellow barriers around the burial site, while sanctuary staff moved carefully through the rain-soaked grass, collecting the chairs nobody had bothered picking up earlier. But the biggest change came from the people themselves. Nobody looked at Kobo with fear anymore. They looked at him with the fragile caution people use after realizing they have deeply misunderstood someone. Emily stayed beside the silverback while investigators secured Daniel's Jeep and copied the files from the recorder. Kobo remained calm through all of it. No pacing, no roaring, just silent watching, as though he finally believed the humans were paying attention. Marcus stood near the coffin for several minutes without speaking before quietly asking Emily something nobody expected. Did Daniel still keep the old radio? Emily blinked in surprise. The one from the feeding station? Marcus nodded slowly. When we were kids, he used to play the same folk songs every morning while working with the animals. Koba heard them for years. Emily remembered immediately. Daniel kept a scratched-up portable radio inside the sanctuary kitchen, older than half the staff members there. Most mornings, soft music drifted across the refuge while Daniel prepared food buckets before sunrise. Koba always became noticeably calmer whenever the music played. 40 minutes later, after most funeral guests had left, a sanctuary employee returned carrying the old radio wrapped carefully inside a plastic tarp to protect it from the weather. The little device looked almost ridiculous sitting in the middle of a cemetery beside police cruisers and memorial flowers. Marcus hesitated before turning it on. Static crackled through the speaker at first. Then a slow acoustic guitar melody drifted softly into the cold afternoon air. The reaction from Koba was immediate. The giant silverback froze completely beside the Jeep. His shoulders, which had been tense for hours, slowly lowered for the first time all day. Emily felt tears burn behind her eyes as Koba carefully turned toward the sound. Not excited, not startled, relieved. The music was one of the few pieces of Daniel still left in the world. Marcus swallowed hard before walking toward the coffin again. Quietly, without announcing it to anyone, he removed the framed photograph sitting beside the flowers at the front of the memorial display. It was a picture of Daniel in his 20s sitting cross-legged in the grass beside a much younger Koba, both staring directly at the camera. Marcus carried the frame through the mud and gently placed it near the gorilla instead. "He would have wanted you to have this," he whispered. Koba stared at the photograph for several long seconds. Then something happened that nobody present would ever forget. The silverback slowly lowered himself onto the wet ground beside the picture and rested one massive hand protectively across the edge of the frame without damaging it. It was not possessive. It looked more like recognition, like gratitude. The cemetery became so quiet that even the distant rain seemed to disappear. One of the deputies quietly removed his hat. The little boy from earlier sat beside his mother without speaking, holding the umbrella Koba had returned. Even the animal control handlers remained motionless, no longer seeing a dangerous animal in front of them, but a grieving soul trying to hold onto the last remaining pieces of someone he loved. As the soft music continued playing across the cemetery, Emily noticed something else. Koba was no longer glancing nervously toward the trees or the parking lot. For the first time since arriving, he had stopped searching for danger. Slowly, the silverback leaned his head down beside Daniel's photograph while the old radio played through the misty afternoon air. And surrounded by the people who had finally chosen to protect him instead of fear him, Koba closed his eyes for the very first time since Daniel died. 3 months after the funeral, the atmosphere at Cascade Wildlife Refuge felt completely different. The federal investigation triggered by Daniel's recordings had quietly exposed a trafficking operation hidden inside the sanctuary's transport network for nearly 2 years. Several arrests were made, including Victor Hale and 2 outside contractors who had used maintenance vehicles to move endangered animals across state lines. News stations covered the story for weeks, but inside the refuge, People spoke less about the arrests and more about the gorilla who had tried to warn everyone long before the humans understood what was happening. Visitors now stopped outside Koba's habitat with a kind of reverence instead of curiosity. Some brought flowers and left them beside the memorial plaque the sanctuary installed near the entrance. Others simply stood silently, watching the silverback move slowly through the tall grass beneath the pine trees Daniel planted years earlier. But the biggest change happened inside the staff themselves. Emily noticed that nobody rushed past Koba's enclosure anymore. Rangers greeted him every morning the same way Daniel once had. Maintenance workers paused to play the old radio while cleaning nearby walkways. Even Marcus began visiting the refuge every Sunday afternoon without telling anyone beforehand. At first, he only sat quietly on the bench outside the habitat for a few minutes before leaving. Then one day, Emily arrived early and found something unexpected resting beside the enclosure gate. A small wooden toolbox Daniel used to carry during feeding rounds. Marcus had restored it himself. Inside were several carefully folded photographs of Daniel and Koba over the years, protected in clear plastic sleeves so rain could not damage them. Koba noticed the box immediately. He approached slowly, sat beside it for nearly an hour, and gently turned over each photograph one by one using only the tips of his fingers. Emily never told Marcus what she saw that day, but the next Sunday the older man brought another photograph. Then another. It became a quiet routine between them. Nobody announced it. Nobody needed to. As winter slowly gave way to spring, Koba began changing too. The heaviness surrounding him after Daniel's death started to soften little by little. He played with enrichment puzzles again. He wandered farther through the outdoor habitat instead of sitting near the service gate every night. Sometimes, just before sunset, he would climb onto the large flat rock overlooking the sanctuary lake and sit there listening while the old radio played from the maintenance shed nearby. One evening, Emily stayed late finishing paperwork when she noticed something that stopped her in the middle of the pathway. Koba was sitting beside the enclosure fence holding Daniel's old photograph against his chest, while a group of younger gorillas from the neighboring habitat gathered quietly nearby watching him. The silverback looked calm, not lonely anymore, almost as if the grief he carried had finally become memory instead of pain. Emily stood there for several minutes without interrupting him. Then she noticed the small detail that made tears fill her eyes again. Resting beside Koba in the grass was the little black funeral program he had carried to Daniel's Jeep that rainy afternoon at the cemetery. The edges were worn now, faded by weather and time, but Koba had somehow kept it safe all those months. He had protected the truth. He had protected the memory. And in the end, the humans finally learned to protect him too. Sometimes the purest soul in the room is the one that cannot speak.